This is not a book, it's just that I had to write it kind of big so I could see, okay? When you get my age, you start losing your sight. So even though I have glasses, I still have to go this way and that way, okay? All right, first of all, I'd like to thank Chris in his absence for inviting me to come and speak with you tonight. It really is an honor to be able to come and share with you our the history of the Latimer School. And then I also would like to thank Mr. Shelley. Mr. Shelley has been with us from the very conception. He's a very faithful worker. He's on our committee. He has been instrumental in getting us to where we are right now. And I really want to thank him.
Very well, thank you.
And then I want to thank Mr. Latimer, because in a way, I want to dedicate this program to Yolanda. Some of you remember Yolanda McCormick.
Yes.
Yolanda was my girlfriend. We went to college together, and we were just the best of friends. I call her Yodi. So Yodi approached me when Mr. Latimer, George Latimer, was doing the time capsule. And she asked me, she said, Carolyn, what is it that you all would like to put in the time capsule? So I said, well, the only thing I know that would be noteworthy would be about the history of the Latimer School. We have kept the history going over the years. And so she and I worked on the flash drive, and we put it in the time capsule. So in 50 years, at the end of 50 years, when you open the time capsule,
2060.
That's right. 2067, because it was done in, I think it was December 2017.
Yeah, I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so when you open it, you will find the history of the Latimer School.
If they can operate a flash drive.
If they can. And I think I put in a hard copy, a book, because every year we have a banquet, and they publish, it's really the outline or the program that we use for our banquet. And in it, we have alumni members, and sometimes we put the old pictures, the new pictures, or whatever. And we've been doing this for quite a while, okay? And so it gives me great pleasure to be here tonight to share with you the history of the Latimer School. Now, the Latimer School has a long and rich history, and it just didn't start with the Latimer School. It goes back to 1889, okay? The historic school market era of over 135 years. Yes, it was recently listed on the National Register of Historic Places on May 20th, 2024. Today I want to share with you just some of the things that happened in our journey as the African American leaders and parents. They worked towards providing educational opportunities for their children. And see, because it goes back like even before 1889, because as you remember, before the Civil War, African Americans were not allowed to learn. They were not allowed to read or write. They didn't have formal education. And they didn't enjoy a lot of the privileges that others enjoyed. It was, like I said, it was illegal for slaves to be taught to read and write. And after the Civil War ended in April 9th, 1865, the country went through a radical change. Although blacks were excited about the prospect of their new freedom, they still faced difficult challenges. They were still not free from racial injustices. They were still unable to vote in much of the country and work in certain jobs, to use certain facilities, or to even enjoy equal education and many other privileges. The fight for freedom was not over. It was just beginning. It truly was a time for this country to reconstruct society to include the newly freed slaves. Most of the southern states readily embraced the change, and they wrote new laws and social justices to include the black Americans. But South Carolina was resistant to change. They were afraid of losing their wealth. So they created ordinances and black codes and Jim Crow laws to hold on to the pre-Civil War society. Now, during the time of Reconstruction, few schools existed for rural African Americans. Matter of fact, Latta first school was in 1877. Now, the reason even though there was not a school in Latta, but the ones that were the African Americans that lived in Latta, they went to school in Marion County, because Latta was a part of Marion County at that particular time. So they went to school in Marion. Now, it's kind of unique in a way because a lot of the parents didn't have transportation. So what they would do, they would hire someone to take care of their children, a boarding house where the kids would stay during the week, and then on the weekend they would go home. So that's how they were able to get an education at that particular time, because Latta did not have a school for African American students. But because of our parents' desire for their children to have the same educational opportunities as white children, the African American leaders and parents in Latta, they came together and they started their own school. First of all, they reached out to the Odd Fellows fraternity. Some of you may be familiar with the Odd Fellows. Now, the Odd Fellows, they were an early fraternity and charitable organization, much like the Freemason. And so they reached out to the Odd Fellows to ask them if they could use their fellowship hall. Now, the Odd Fellows, they were sort of, they were an odd group. That's how they got their name, really, because they were odd, because it was not normal for people to help those that were in need. The downtrodden, the poor, the sick, the orphans. And so that is how they got their name. Now, the original fraternity order was founded in England. It was in 1600s. Now, several unofficial lodges existed in the United States in 1806, but the first independent Order of the Odd Fellows was established in Baltimore, Maryland in 1819. Now, the goal of the philanthropic was to help others who were, like I said, who was less fortunate and who needed their help. And they also were known for their community services. Now, in 1889, the first school for colored children in Latta was open in the Odd Fellows Hall. The hall was located on a site directly behind the old Jackson McGill funeral home on Washington Street. It's no longer there. They tore it down a couple of years back. But we know exactly where it was. Now, the first teacher they had was Mr. Cardenfield Chapel. and he was their first teacher, and he stayed there until 1895. No, until another, Mr. Bethay, took over. Now, let me explain to you now. The wind of change moved very slow in South Carolina. Now, you know, whenever you're trying to do something, there's always going to be resistance. And this was evident when in 1895, the state of South Carolina adopted the Constitution that mandated racial segregation in public places and schools. Unfortunately, this did not deter our parents' struggle against segregated education. The Negro citizens of Latta continued to fight against the racial injustice in the Latimer school system. White Americans in public, whites, now how many of you know? Oh yeah, that's what I got my thought. In 1886, they fought against the Supreme Court, decided in the Plessy versus Ferguson case.
1896.
In 1896, pardon me, that it was constitutional to separate black and white Americans in public. Now, as long as everyone received the same kind of public services. But how many of you know, as long as separate, it could never be inevitable equal. And that segregation marked one race was being superior to the other. Now, in the fall of 1898, A.R. Bethay took over and served as the teacher until 1902. By this time, the school had outgrown the Oddfellows Hall, so the location on Willard Street, directly behind Weston Chapel, was purchased. And a two-room building was erected at that time. And later, in 1915, another room was added to the two-room structure. And the term of school was lengthened from 5 months to 6 months. Now, the school known as, at that particular time, was known as the Latta Colored Grade School. 9th grade was the senior class. Now, between 1915 and 1925, Mr. A.W. Bethay Jr., Mr. Bartell, and Mr. Bacote served as principals, during which the school continued to grow, and the 3-room building was remodeled and made into 2 stories. You'll see the picture over on the table. Now, the first floor, it had 5 classrooms on the first floor and a future auditorium and classroom on the second floor, with seed money that was given to the school from the Julius Rosenwald Foundation. Now, a lot of you may be familiar with the Rosenwald schools to accommodate the new growth, so they gave them some money. Now, let me give you a little background about Mr. Rosenwald. Mr. Rosenwald, he was the CEO of Sears, Roebuck and Company in Chicago. He was committed to Booker T. Washington's vision of educating African Americans and training them. So, from 1910 into the 1930s, more than 53 school buildings were constructed in African American communities throughout the 15 states, because there was no buses for the kids to be transported to a central school. So what he did, he built the schools in the communities where the children lived. Even though some still had to walk, it was not as far as it would have been if it was in a local place. Now, Dillon County had a total of 18 Rosenwald schools. I have a list on the table that you can look at. Now, when they were looking for the Rosenwald School, Mr. Don Barkley, he couldn't find it. Well, we know where it is. So I hope that our efforts together, we can update that information so that it will be accurate, because we know where those sites were. And we would like to be able to put markers there so that children can see where their forefathers went to school. And at that particular time, home economics and agriculture was introduced into the curriculum. The school term now was 7 months, and the faculty consisted of 8 instructors. Now, from 1928 to 1937, Mr. Holman, he served as principal of the Dillon County Training School. Now, under his administration, there were many improvements, but in spite of all that was accomplished, the schools were not equal facilities. There was no running water. There was no indoor bathrooms. We had used textbooks to learn out of. There was no central heat. And most of all, there was no buses. Because I can remember many days going to school, and we were walking, and the school bus with the white children were in the bus, and they were taunting at us. But it didn't stop us. It didn't stop. So, however, in spite of the numerous inadequacies, the school continued to grow, and a new Rosenwald school, grammar school, was erected with 8 classrooms and an auditorium. The only such building for colored children in Dillon County at that time. Now, after Mr. Holman, there was Mr. Wilkinson. He became principal, and he served for several years. The school made great strides under the administration of Mr. Wilkinson, but they continued, and as they continued the struggle for equal education by strengthening their own schools, and they fought against racial segregation. The Dillon County Training School educated the local students for decades. But when a statewide program to construct new schools began in the 1950s, it transformed the architect of education in South Carolina. Now, in that same year, even though the program had started in 1950, within that same year, another lawsuit was filed in South Carolina by African American parents called Briggs versus Elliott for separate but equal facilities and to obtain buses. Now, the parents lost that case, but the federal judge in charge in Charleston, who presided over that case, advised them to sue to desegregate the schools rather than separate but equal facilities. So that's how that case later became part of the famous Brown versus the Board of Education case. So in an effort to create separate but equal schools, Governor James Burns, he instituted a $75 million equalization program. Now, the equalization program was to equalize the black and white schools. Now, this was done to forestall, because he already felt like that the Supreme Court was going to rule to desegregate the schools in the state of South Carolina. So he started this program in order to try and forestall this order by the Supreme Court. Now, the program was funded by 3% sales tax. Now remember, white schools were also built during this time. Matter of fact, the Latimer Middle School was being built the same time as Latta Elementary School. Now, the reason why the white schools were built at this time was because It was so that the white citizens would be willing to accept the tax increase. So they had to get something out of this. But in spite of the governor's effort, on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education stripped away constitutional sanctions for segregation by race and made equal opportunity in education the law of the land. Now, under the administration of Mr. Giles, who was the DCT school principal at that time, the school burned, okay? And so the students had to go back to the Odd Fellows Hall temporarily until the new school was built. And the present Latimer High School was erected in 1955, and the elementary school was built 2 years later in 1956. Now, when the building was finished, it was given the name Latimer in honor of Louis H. Latimer, an African-American inventor. The school represents the state of South Carolina's effort to preserve segregation through its school equalization program. Latimer is just one of 700 equalization schools constructed in South Carolina between 1950 and 1959 to avoid desegregating its school system. The class of 1955 was the first class graduating from Latimer High, and Mr. R.L. McBride, some of you may know Mr. McBride or heard of Mr. McBride. He was the first principal of Latimer High, and he was principal, and he became the principal in 1958, and he remained in that position until long after the schools were integrated. Now, Mr. McBride, he made many great strides. He was an excellent principal. I remember whenever we had an auditorium program, and he would come up on the stage with that heavy voice, and he commanded the attention of every child in that room. So he was a pillar in the community. And even though he made many strides in the academic program of the schools, the era of the DCT Latimer schools was phased out in 1992 when the name of the Latimer School was changed to Latta Elementary School. And as the curtain closed on the era of Dillon County Training School, there is no evidence to remind the future generations where their foreparents attended school. But there are thousands of alumni that attended these schools, DCT and Latimer, that entered various professional fields thanks to the education that they received at these schools, including some of even came back and worked at DCT and Latimer. So you can take away the physical evidence, but you can never take away the memories. And so when we as alumni, when we come together and we think about, we talk, we laugh and everything, and we reminisce, you know, it's good to look back and see where you come from. But even at that, there's a void that's in our hearts because you remember those fond days and they're gone. And the world can never fill them. So the goal and objective of our project are to preserve and restore the historic Latimer School in Latta. It stands at the center of several significant chapters in the civil rights movement. The school also stands as a historic monument to the endurance of the Latta African American community during the period of racial segregation. The words of the famous English poet I alluded to a few minutes ago could better explain when he said, and he was a poet that wrote about slavery, and this is one of his famous poetry. He said, "What peaceful hours I once enjoyed, how sweet the memory still, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill." Again, I would like to thank Chris for allowing me to come and to talk to you today about the history of Latta. I hope I have just given you a glimpse of the struggle that we went through, because there were other things I could have said, but I wanted to kind of condense it. But I thank you for your patience. I thank you for just being able or wanting to help us. And so if you would like to make a donation to our efforts, I have some cards over there, and if you want some information that you can take home with you. Now, the pamphlet doesn't have all of the information on it, but it will give you a glimpse of what the struggle was. And we also have a list of the Rosenwald schools, if you would like to look at those. And you can see the two-story building, the first Rosenwald school, and then the second one. So we thank you for allowing us to come and share with you. And again, thank Mr. Chris when he comes back. And we appreciate you. Thank you very much.